You call on me to read them.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. For this allowable ex parte, I'm going to ask Mr. Melcher to read the docket.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioners, we're here pursuant to a notice of request for allowable ex parte communication briefing requested by Duke Energy Carolinas, LLC and Duke Energy Progress, LLC, scheduled for today here in the Commission hearing room, August 14th at 10 a.m. The subject matter to be discussed at today's briefing is key components of Act 62, and the Commission docket numbers that are associated with this presentation are the following. All of these are 2019 filings: 169E, 170E, 182E, 185E, 186E, 195E, 196E, 207E, 208E, 210E, 211E, 224E, and 225E. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Nelson, are you doing the ORS thing? Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners, Mr. Chairman, and everybody else who's here. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Jeff Nelson. I'm Chief Counsel for the Office of Regulatory Staff, and I'm here today as the designee of the Executive Director of ORS for this allowable ex parte being presented by Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress. As the ORS representative, it's my duty to certify the record of this proceeding to the Chief Clerk of the PSC within 72 hours after this briefing under South Carolina Code Annotated Section 58-3-260C. The requirements of that statute in part are that the allowable ex parte be confined to the subject matter which has been noticed. In this case, as Mr. Melcher has just indicated, the noticed issue here is key components of Act 62. Therefore, I ask that everyone here please refrain from discussing any matters not related to that subject. Secondly, the statute prohibits any participants, commissioners, commission staff from requesting or giving any commitments, predetermination, or prediction regarding any action by any commissioner as to any ultimate or penultimate issue which either is or is likely to come before the commission. Third, I would like to ask the participants, commissioners, and staff to attempt to refrain from referencing any reports, articles, or statutes which are not included as part of the presentation that Duke's giving this morning. That just saves us the time of trying to track those down within the short time period that we have. As a final note for everybody in the audience, please make sure that you signed in, that you picked up a form, and that you sign and return that form before you leave today. Again, that has to be part of the record that we certify in this proceeding. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we begin, I just want to recognize the fact that Commissioner Williams is attending by phone, I think.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Williams is here.
Great. Glad to have you here. Mr. Ellerby,
Thank you, sir.
I think I'm calling on you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. My name is Frank Ellerby, representing the company with respect to this ex parte briefing this morning. We have presentations, slides that will be discussed with you by two presenters, and I'm going to introduce them and sit down and be quiet. Heather Shirley Smith, Deputy General Counsel of the company, will be presenting, as will George Brown. And Mr. Brown is General Manager of Distributed Energy Technology Policy and Strategic Investment. And their presentation was described by Mr. Melcher when he read the docket. One thing I did want to make clear is we are aware that there is an oral argument scheduled for next week in these dockets and others, and it is our intention to not talk about to stay away from any of the issues that are going to be argued before the Commission next week which are as we understand it, procedural scheduling issues. So that is our intent, and if that issue arises, just understand that that's what our presenters are trying to do. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, Ms. Smith and Mr. Brown, we'll turn it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I appreciate your time today. I'm George Brown, and I'm going to begin our comments today, and Heather will join in on certain topics as we walk through the slide deck. I'm going to start by introducing a little bit Duke Energy. I think you're probably familiar, but there may be things in my introductory slides that you may not be aware of. And then we'll go straight into the Act and the relevant parts of the Act that we wanted to try to address today. We're also going to talk about Duke Energy's support for the Act. We are supportive of the Act. We were supportive in the legislative process as part of the compromise solutions that were reached in the Act, and we look forward to working on the implementation of the Act. So starting with slide 2, this is a summary slide for the scope of Duke Energy in South Carolina. We have 2 utilities, one of which covers the upstate, the other of which covers the PD region. We have 760,000 plus customers across the service territory, 6 operating nuclear plants. We pay quite a bit in annual property taxes to the state and are a large employer in the state. This is the electric service area. It does not include Piedmont Natural Gas at all, and I'm not going to be talking about Piedmont Natural Gas in this presentation today. The next slide, I want to speak to sort of the unique situation that Duke Energy is in, and the situation is that we have 2 individual utilities that span 2 states, but each utility is one power system. So when we do our planning for each utility, we consider the entirety of the system, both what's happening in both states, both in terms of what's happening to our load and what's happening to our generation resources. So I think when one talks about how much renewable energy we have to think about it across the 2 states rather than just in individual states. And that's what this point is designed to point out, is that we have a total of 3,327 megawatts of installed solar across the 2 utility service areas, balancing areas, across the 2 states. Most of this, the vast majority of this, is in North Carolina, and most of it results from PURPA implementation that North Carolina had undertaken over the years. And one of the things I want to cover today is we think there are some useful insights for the Commission that, based on our experience in North Carolina, as the Commission looks to implement Act 62 here in South Carolina. We expect more than 7,000 to 8,000 megawatts of solar, again, across the 2 utilities, across both states, over the next 5 to 8 years. So the solar is not done. In addition to what we've got going on in North Carolina, we will have development in South Carolina. We already have a lot of development in South Carolina, and we continue that trend expect that trend to continue.
I think just before we leave that slide, a couple of other things to be mindful of. And when we look at these, at the two systems, the light green and the light blue, how does this translate into proceedings before this commission and in North Carolina? And so, the balancing authorities for each utility are housed within those colors. But, Duke Energy Carolinas, of course, is one single legal entity, one system in the green. Duke Energy Progress is one single legal entity, one system in the blue. And so we will see this system information and filings before this commission and companion filings in North Carolina. So sometimes we get questions about our IRPs, for example. Why do you have all of this North Carolina discussion in your South Carolina IRP? That's a pretty common question that we get. And that's because everything that happens in North is for the system, things that happen in South Carolina are for the system. And so the system, of course, does not recognize that there's a state line in between. So when we file out our IRPs, you will see a lot of North Carolina information about generation sited in North Carolina programs, and vice versa. It happens in both states. So it's a single plan that happens to be filed in 2 states for both companies. The other thing to keep in mind is we're still required to keep those separate. We have merger conditions that require us to operate each company uniquely, and so we're still doing 2 of everything because it's 2 legal entities. The other thing to keep in mind is that when we look at some of the things that are relevant to this proceeding, George will be talking about balancing areas, which we just mentioned is housed within those colors. But we'll also be talking about avoided cost. And so avoided costs aren't really any different in terms of how the system views them. So, for example, as you look to Green Tech DEC, for example, a generating resource serves both states. The fuel burned in that generating resource serves both states. That's allocated in fuel proceedings, and also in fuel proceedings, that's where we recover avoided costs by statute in South Carolina. And those are allocated. North Carolina has avoided cost, and South Carolina has avoided cost as determined respectively by the commissions. But the costs from those avoided costs are also allocated and recovered through fuel. So it's just a little complication from Duke. We understand that the commission is familiar with that, but just wanted to sort of put a placeholder for some of those concepts because they will come up in other sections of the Act that George will address.
Thank you. Commissioner Belser, you got a question?
Mr. Brown, would you repeat the amount of solar that you indicated y'all expect to come on in the next number of years, and give the number of years as well?
Yes, and these are approximate numbers because we will be publishing more formal numbers when we file our IRPs for the 2 respective utilities. But I think our current estimates are somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 megawatts of solar between the 2 utilities. So I'm combining the utilities just for this purpose, and it would be over the next 7, maybe 8 years.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
are we giving questions to the panelists now, or are we waiting to the end? If it doesn't matter to me, but if we are, I did have a question that I wrote down that I can wait until the end.
I think we were just getting a clarification on that. Why don't we wait with questions so we can keep their presentation moving, Commissioner Williams?
Got it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, very good. This slide, I think, explains the trend in our generation fleet in the Carolinas. This is, again, a combined slide for the 2 utilities for both states. So, again, it's the entire fleet we have. And you can see that we have a dramatic reduction in the amount of coal that we will be burning to produce energy. We've already had a dramatic reduction. We expect that trend to continue. You see a dramatic increase in the amount of renewable energy that we will be using for our needs, for our customers' needs between 2005 and 2033. That 14% kind of explains, that 8,000 megawatt number is a big part of that 14% of energy that we would see that will be actually produced and used by our customers. Highlighting South Carolina for a moment, we have a very low carbon intensity generation mix in South Carolina. We have a highly efficient, essentially brand new combined cycle in Anderson County, and then we have our substantial nuclear operations in South Carolina, where we have 6 units that you see there, 5,200 plus megawatt hours. Right now in South Carolina, there is not a great deal of solar that is actually connected. There is a lot more under construction. I think some of that has been just the industry getting started. I think the other thing is there will be some South Carolina projects that came out of the North Carolina Competitive Procurement Program that we just announced the winners of. So there will be additional solar added to the mix from that program in our service territory here in South Carolina. And we have a very large interconnection queue. And just to make sure everyone's on the same page, the interconnection queue is sort of the sum of all the projects that are looking to eventually interconnect into our system. And most of them will end up selling their energy to us. They don't necessarily have to sell their energy to us, but in this case, most of them will end up selling their energy to us. And that interconnection process is a complicated one that I think many utilities across the country are struggling with the size of the queues. We have among the largest queues in the country, and I think that's something that we are working hard to improve. But it is something that we think needs to be done through some form of stakeholder process rather than generally some sort of unilateral process. That's what our preferred path would be, to get reform for the queue so that the queue itself will become more efficient and the good projects will continue on and the less good projects will move out of the queue. Also in South Carolina, we have a good deal of pumped hydro and traditional hydro. So now I'm going to turn a little bit to the Act itself. We think that one of the key themes in the Act is the balance that we're trying to achieve collectively and that the Commission will be ultimately deciding on the cost of the renewable energy for customers compared to the benefits of the renewable energy that the customers receive. And this was a key reason that we supported the Act. We think that it can be, if done correctly, renewables are a very important part of the mix, of the future generation mix of the utility. This Act provides good guardrails for close examination of the impact to customers, including both reliability and cost. And I think, this one bullet down below says that fair and reasonable are mentioned numerous times over the course of the Act. And in almost every section of the Act, there was some citation about making sure that the impact to customers is reasonable as we go to implement the Act and build on the success that already exists in South Carolina for solar. So why else did we support Act 62? Well, firstly, we support policy that promotes efficient and low-cost renewable energy, and we think this policy can do that. Second, we support policy that balances the interests of renewable investors and utility customers. I think it is important that we don't burden customers with unnecessary costs. We have seen situations where that has happened, and we want to work hard to avoid that. Third, Duke Energy hears from many of its customers that those customers want more renewable energy options themselves. And this Act provides for those sorts of options for customers who want to adopt more renewable energy. There are large programs and small programs in this Act, and I'm going to describe a little more later what they are. And then finally, we have a lot of experience in connecting utility-scale solar. We've probably been connecting more solar on average over the last 5 years than certainly any utility east of the Mississippi, and maybe California has had more, but there aren't too many. So we know how to do it, and we know that it's an important piece of the generation mix going forward. And we believe in solar as a useful resource. I'd like to spend some time a little bit talking about PURPA. One of the key elements of Act 62 is for the commission to address the implementation of PURPA in the state of South Carolina. So to do that, I think it's important to have some context about PURPA. PURPA is a law that was passed in 1978. I remember 1978, and I remember that we had a very different energy environment than we have today. We were very dependent on foreign oil. We had just had some energy crises. And Congress took upon itself to try to make sure that as many domestic sources of energy could be produced as possible. And I think this was one of those attempts to do that. And in the Act, it says that the utilities must purchase from qualified renewable resources, and there's definitions about what those are in the Act, energy made available to them up to the avoided cost or incremental cost of the utility. So it was a mandate. It was a requirement. If you look at PURPA through the years, most of the PURPA that was done was not actually solar or wind for many years because those technologies were much too expensive to be able to meet the avoided cost test. We had PURPA contracts with hydro producers. We had PURPA contracts with waste heat producers, municipal landfills that would sell us the energy. That was most of it. But beginning around 2009, 2010, with the cost of solar falling and wind falling, that's when wind and solar started to be the most prevalent form of PURPA. And that's where we are today. So how does PURPA work? Well, first of all, it creates a must-take purchase obligation on the utilities. We must purchase based on whatever the rates the commission sets. Second, there's no limit on the total megawatts that we have to purchase. We have to purchase whatever the market can make work at those administratively set rates. Third, the utility must purchase the output even if we don't actually need that capacity for our customers. PURPA is silent to that. Now, that doesn't mean that we are required to pay for capacity that we don't need as part of the rate. That's up to the commission as to what the rate is. And PURPA is very clear that that's going to be up to the state commissions on the rates. And then fourth, all utility customers pay for PURPA. This is a pass-through to us. You know, we execute the purchase power agreements, and then we flow them through in South Carolina through our fuel proceedings. And we also do that through our wholesale contracts and also through our North Carolina fuel proceedings. So it is just a pass-through to the utility. So what does PURPA not include? It does not require a competitive process to source the lowest cost energy. That was not the intent of Congress at the time. It was more, we need to do things to support alternative energy. It wasn't a situation where alternative energy necessarily was going to be low cost. Two, it does not allow the utility to reduce purchases for economic reasons. So if we have, what that means is, if we have a PURPA contract that was signed several years ago, and it was signed when the avoided cost rate was higher than it is today, we still have to purchase that energy and take that energy, except under certain very limited situations where we are allowed to curtail the solar in the event that we have a problem managing the grid. So there has to be a clear operational problem where there's nowhere for the energy to go, for example, or we have a line failure and we can't take the energy away. That's an example of when we're allowed to curtail under PURPA. And then finally, PURPA does not really provide for much flexibility for the PURPA solar in our planning process. When we plan our systems, the IRP plan, for example, we have to take into account the anticipated amount of PURPA solar, and we have to let that energy flow regardless of whether we actually need it at that point in time or not. And we have to design the system around the PURPA in order to be able to manage the system and balance the load against the generation. So in terms of implementation, PURPA is jointly administered. We have FERC, which sets broad rules to the states around what the terms of the PURPA implementation have to be, what perhaps things like a concept that's popular to be discussed called the legally enforceable obligation, which is when is it that the utility actually has an obligation to purchase that energy from a qualified facility. But most of the most important, in our opinion, implementation based on our experience is actually determined at the state level. The state is going to determine what the avoided cost rate is. The state generally will determine what the length of the contracts are. And those are two key elements when we think about PURPA and we think about balancing the risk to customers from the implementation of PURPA against the risk to the developers. So turning to the next slide, I wanted to just point out some of the key sections of the Act that hit on PURPA implementation. And I think, I'm not going to read you these, but I think the big takeaway is the following. What we have found in our experience is the key risk that we want to avoid is having a large number of executed PURPA contracts that we cannot get out of that are above the current avoided cost. And there's several ways that can be accomplished. One thing is, of course, to get the rate as accurate as you can at the time. You don't want to, overinflate the rate for any reason, and I'm not suggesting we would do that, but I'm just saying, generally speaking, that's the first thing. The second thing is the contract term. We definitely understand the need for a certain length of contract for the solar developer because they need a certain amount of certainty and to reduce their risk to a certain level in order for them to feel confident with their investment. But on the other hand, the customer is taking the other side of that equation. And in the event that you end up with very long-term contracts that are set based on very old rates, you can be substantially out of the money compared to the current avoided cost. And in fact, that is the situation that we find ourselves in North Carolina. There were 15-year contracts that were mandated by the commission for 5 megawatt standard offer contracts, and those contracts now are substantially out of the money. And we've been very open about that fact. So the other thing that we like about 62 is Act 62, we believe the right way to source solar, since it is going to be part of the mix, is through a competitive process. We don't have as much difficulty supporting a long-term contract if it's competitively sourced. And the simple reason for that is, at least in that situation, we have a defined number of megawatts that we're looking to source. We might have a price cap and say we're not going to pay more than X for any of this solar. We can factor in the interconnection costs of the solar, or we can have the developer pay for those, which would raise the price, but we'd still have our price cap. It's a much more controllable situation, and you can do it periodically, and you can take advantage of a falling technology market by sort of layering in volumes over time. And this act does provide the commission with the authorization to approve programs like that.
The other thing I would add to this section is George has done a good job of describing sort of the give and take and the tensions that exist on both sides of that equation, and you see that within the Act. And there'll be a lot more discussion about that in future proceedings before this commission. But of course, the idea of term and the concept of term has already been answered by the legislature for now. meaning we do have a 10-year term that is within Act 62, and so that question again has been answered for now, but not without limit. That term applies up until the section articulated in F2. That 10-year term applies until nameplate capacity equals 20% of the 5-year average of retail peak load for South Carolina. After that time, the Commission is directed to readdress the concept of term in another docket. So while the question of term at 10 years has been answered for now, there will be another docket in the future where what that term will be, whether it's more or less, and the Commission has been directed in Act 62 to consider that, to consider longer terms. But whether it will be more or less than 10 years will be a subject for a future docket when that threshold is reached. Also, I'll take this next slide, George. One of the other pieces of Act 62 that the company certainly enthusiastically supported was the concept of a qualified independent third party to serve as a resource for what is essentially a highly technical and often hotly debated area. There are a lot of nuances, a lot of technical, very sophisticated concepts embedded within these types of proceedings. So we were very supportive of this concept of a qualified independent third party, and understanding that's been certainly on the top of the minds of a lot of folks in this arena of late. One of the things that we liked about this section and that we think is important in this section is the transparency that we believe this section contains. That includes the applying the ex parte prohibitions to the qualified independent third party, and we think that that will be fair and just for all parties so that no party is surprised, so that the evidence contained in the report or sought by the qualified independent third party is part of the record, is available for everyone subject to the limits of confidentiality. And so we don't presume to, of course, provide any insight as to how the Commission may work through those issues. We know that they are top of mind from you, from certainly the conversations on Monday. But we wanted to point out that that was one of the things that gave us confidence in this new resource, in this new role, and that the company's ability to respond and every party's ability to respond to the conclusions contained in that report would be retained as afforded by the Administrative Procedures Act and Article 1, Section 22 of the South Carolina Constitution, which allows and affords due process in administrative proceedings. So we look forward to being a part of working through that process in a transparent way and seeing when that report might be available, hopefully in time for a hearing and for parties to respond.
The next slide actually summarizes some of the key customer program features of the Act that we support very, very much. The first one is the Voluntary Renewable Energy Program, which is very similar to our filed Green Source Advantage program. And this is a large customer program. I think it's 1 megawatt load minimum requirement in aggregate for a customer to participate into this program. And in the program, the customer will actually be able to negotiate with the solar provider the all-in price that the solar provider will pay. And the way that that will actually work is the solar provider will build the facility, will produce the energy. Duke will actually purchase the energy and take that energy and use it for all customers, just like it does every other PPA that we have. And it will charge customers for the avoided capacity and energy portion of that contract, because they are getting the energy and capacity value of the contract, but that the single customer will pay any difference needed between that credit and what the solar provider wants or needs for its economic purposes. And I think that kind of program, which is very similar to our North Carolina program, will be attractive to customers. I believe it is very fair for non-participants. It ensures that they are paying the value of the energy and not a premium for the energy in any way, shape, or form. So we were very supportive of this provision. The other program that is mentioned is community solar. It is not as specific, that section of the Act is not as specific as the Voluntary Renewable Energy Program portion, but generally speaking, it provides a broad framework for us to build upon the success of our shared solar program that we've had as part of our Act 236 DER programs. A key component there is that the non-participating customers are not going to be asked to pay any subsidy or any value above what they would actually receive from the program, which is, I think, a good feature and which is, I think, the right direction for the state to move to make sure that that the people who are paying, who want the renewables, are paying for the renewables.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Would you look at the first code section cited on that slide and tell me if that's a typo in that? 58-31? Should that be 41-30?
Oh, yeah, you are right. I'm very sorry. Yes. I think that's right. Let me see.
Note that correction. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, the next slide is, I want to talk a little bit about net metering. Act 236 really kicked off net metering for the state, and I think has been very successful in jump-starting the rooftop solar business for the state. And I believe that Act 62 builds upon the success of 236 and provides a glide path from the current state to the future state. So essentially, what's going to go on is we're going to continue to keep the programs the way they are now until May of 2021, at which case we will transfer over to a new tariff, which is called the Solar Choice Metering Tariff, which will be decided by the Commission, but which be designed to remove any subsidization by non-participating customers. And just so we're clear, when I talk about net metering, I mean this would be a situation where a customer actually has solar on the premises and is using that solar both for its own needs, and any excess solar it has, it actually feeds back to the grid and gets a bill credit for that solar that is consumed and the solar that is fed back to the grid. That's what we mean by net metering, which is different than a PPA situation. The other thing that Act 62 did is it removed the solar leasing and net metering caps. I'm sure you recall that Duke Energy Carolinas actually hit the 2% net metering cap, and we did reopen net metering for limited periods of time, but now that issue is over. Finally, I think the other important thing, which is important to the market, is that there is grandfathering guaranteed for customers who will be on the current net metering tariffs through 2029. So they will know what their compensation is through 2029 and will be able to factor that into their decision as to whether they want to make the investment in net metering or not. There are two other provisions that I wanted to talk about in terms of efficiency. One, I'm actually going to go in reverse order here and talk about the refinement of the interconnection procedures. I mentioned that we have 5,500 megawatts in the queue, and we have an awful lot of projects that are working through the process. The process is complicated. We have to study each project to make sure that the distribution system, if it's distribution tied, can handle it, the transmission system can handle it. and that we've got, we're ready to go in the event that they decide to pursue the project, and that all takes time. We think this section is providing us good direction that we should work on improving the interconnection process, making sure that it's fair and reasonable for all. And I think our goal is to do just that at Duke Energy and try to reach a consensus on how we would do queue reform. The other key new piece of legislation in 62 is a system integration study. It's not uncommon for utilities to study their systems to see what it can do under different scenarios in terms of solar penetration or wind or what have you, different sort of climate regimes. But this actually gives the commission the authority to commission a study, and it would be a study for the state of South Carolina, which means that it would actually encompass all of the utilities in South Carolina. And on the next slide, I was able to find what I would call an illustrative map on the right, which kind of lays out what that actually means, because the Act says that the study will be by balancing area. That term balancing area comes back. And before I go on the left over there, I have NERC. NERC is the primary entity responsible for the safe operation of the bulk power transmission system. And in the Carolinas, each balancing area has a balancing area authority. The balancing area authority for Duke Carolinas is Duke Carolinas, and the balancing area authority for Duke Energy Progress is Duke Energy Progress. The balancing area authority for Dominion is Dominion South Carolina, for example. And we are tasked with overseeing the transmission and bulk system to make sure that it will operate within NERC standards. And the map on the right is a third party's attempt. I do not necessarily think this map is 100% accurate in terms of exactly the size of those balancing areas, but I think it does explain, again, that we have balancing areas that cross the two states, whereas Santee Cooper and Dominion, which are the other two balancing areas inside South Carolina, do not cross state lines. But any study that would actually inform what we could do collectively in the state, I would require you to do it by balancing area, because that's how NERC requires us to actually manage our power system.
In looking at the next slide, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on these concepts, but just wanted to touch on some other key provisions in Act 62 as it relates to resource planning. The IRP section 583740 has been greatly expanded by our count. It's been expanded by about approximately 1,000 words. We were very supportive of this IRP, broadening of statutory direction and authority, and we've been talking about this a long time. So you may recall the energy plan process. South Carolina went through a robust process to develop an energy plan, and there were a lot of subcommittees that worked through that plan, and Duke's subject matter experts were part of the IRP subcommittee, and a lot of the work that came out of that subcommittee, we believe, has worked its way into the Act. So from our view, this was one of the, from Duke's view, this was one of the least controversial sections of the Act. In many ways, the statute mirrors a lot of things that we already do, or puts upon us things that we're happy to do and willing to do. And so we were supportive of this process, and that was an easy thing to see happen given the long history of discussion around expanding the IRP processes. The other notable change in resource planning is the Siting Act was amended. 5833-110 was amended, and of course, this the Siting Act applies to generating facilities to be built in South Carolina. And so now, for example, if Duke wanted to build a new generating plant in South Carolina, the Act calls upon us to demonstrate that the facility has been compared to other generation options in terms of cost, reliability, et cetera. And all of those concepts are consistent with least cost planning, and that was another thing that the company supported within the parameters of the Act. The Act also gives additional discretionary measures to the Commission should the company bring forth, or any other company bring forth, a proposal to site a new generating facility that meets the criteria of the Act. That would, could include such things as having an independent evaluator to evaluate any bids, et cetera. But again, that's discretionary. But given our long history of discussion, particularly on the IRP, we were very supportive of these provisions. And just to wrap up, toward the end of the Act, it's noted as Section 16. Thank you. George has spent a lot of time about discussing all of the balancing language in the Act, the consideration of customers, the consideration of public interest, and the balancing that the Act, requires of the Commission, in our view, in making decisions. And we think a lot of that comes home to roost in Section 16, which requires an affirmative finding supported by the preponderance of the evidence, and that description to be included in Commission orders. So for the costs that customers will bear coming out of Act 62, and some of those costs are complete pass-throughs. They go, straight through, for example, avoided costs through our fuel rate, that we believe this section asks the Commission to make those findings and make those determinations in its orders to really round out the balancing and the guidance that's included throughout the Act. Now, that brings us to the end of our presentation. We've pointed out a lot of the key provisions from Duke Energy's perspective. We could be up here another 30, 40 minutes, which I don't think anyone wants us to be. There's a lot of other good stuff in the Act. There's a lot of other provisions in the Act that we supported, but these were the ones that we wanted to highlight before the Commission today. And I think that brings us to a close, and we, or rather George, would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Well, I'll go to Commissioner Williams first, since he asked first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brown, during the initial portion of your presentation, you referenced the system method that Duke uses South Carolina and North Carolina as opposed to just South Carolina. I was wondering whether or not you could make an alternative argument as to why it would be better just to use South Carolina as opposed to North Carolina and South Carolina.
Because of the way that the system has been built through the decades of the utility's operation, purely from an operating standpoint, we really cannot plan just based on one state because the power flows occur across the states. And we have built transmission lines, for example, to path the power between the states. So from an operating standpoint, it would actually require modification of the system in order to do it differently. I mean, I'm not actually sure how one would do it. I mean, if you wanted to separate the assets into two entities, one a North Carolina entity and one a South Carolina entity, it would actually be a rather large process. And the other thing, unfortunately, is that, for example, if you think about nuclear for a moment, our system planners have planned the system such that the energy that comes from our nuclear plants in South Carolina, which has a certain profile, is manageable because it comes in big blocks of energy. It doesn't do a lot of variation. We don't have the ability to vary the outputs. So we have other resources in North Carolina that enable us to vary the system. And if you didn't have those in North Carolina, the total system would have a problem. And so you would almost be forced to create new assets in each state to serve the load in each state, which, again, from an operating standpoint, and that's what I'm primarily focused on here. Does that help?
It does. I appreciate that, sir. My next question is in reference to the energy that you stated PURPA would require you to purchase even if you didn't need it. What would the company do with energy that it doesn't need?
Well, if we don't need it, one option is to try to sell it into the market. We do have interfaces, for example, into PJM, and if we have available transmission, we can take that energy and sell it into PJM. The other option we have is to back down other generation. So, for example, we would back down a natural gas plant that was operating. And in fact, that's usually what happens, because if you imagine in the morning there is no solar, as the solar starts to produce, we actually, if the load, our demand, is not increasing along with the solar, we actually have to back down the other generation to make way for the solar to come on, so that we don't get out of balance and have an operating event, which is what you would have if you had too much energy on the grid. I understand.
Thank you for answering that for me, sir. So just to clarify a little bit, if you have an excess of solar energy, essentially energy that you don't need, if you back down generation for a gas plant, for instance, would doing so reduce carbon emissions?
Most likely, yes. There would be a reduction if you're backing down a gas plant. There would be a reduction in carbon emissions, yes. If we're in a situation where the load is so low already that none of our gas units are operating, we really can't back down nuclear. Nuclear is the cheapest energy we have, and it is not flexible, but it is cheap. And so if we're in a situation, let's say in April, where in the middle of the day, we've got a very sunny day, but it's not super warm, and a lot of solar is producing, we may be in a situation where we're forced to actually sell the energy or something else, but there is no generation to be able to back down, and it wouldn't reduce our carbon intensity at that point because we don't really have any carbon intense resources that are operating. So it kind of depends on what's on the margin at the time. Okay.
Right. So would I be wrong to think, or not necessarily me, but is it improper or unfounded to think that with the possibility of excess solar available, that a utility should consider downsizing its generation in anticipation for excess solar?
There are times, there will be times when we will not have to build as much new generation because more solar is coming on. However, there are also many times when the need to build the generation, like why do we need new generation? It's happening during a period of time of the day when solar isn't operating. So for example, in the winter at 7 a.m., we've set system peaks and there is no solar generation. And that winter peak is actually forecasted to continue to grow based on our current estimates. So we know that we're going to need to build generation to meet that peak need, but solar won't be able to displace what we've got to build.
And not to mention, I know you can also expand on this, notwithstanding meeting load at a certain time, we also have reserve requirements, and those reserve requirements are independent of what solar is producing at any given time. And our subject matter experts for that topic, are our IRP and other resource planning folks. But that's important to keep in mind, is that even aside from this discussion, we have reserves that we are required to meet.
Understood. This is my final question. Who bears the most risk in bringing new solar energy to the market, excess solar, through the South Carolina Energy Freedom Act? I'm concerned that there may be some unforeseen consequences or potholes that maybe we're not thinking about. Well, so let me be a little more specific. What risk to the ratepayer do you see out there?
I think the primary risk to the ratepayer is going to be if we end up with a policy that creates a market demand for solar. If we end up with rates and contract terms that are overly generous, we're going to end up with too much solar. And exactly what the right mix is, I think we will try to make our case known through this process. If we end up in that situation, then you end up with surplus energy and you end up with an unnecessary cost. So I do think you're right to focus on that. It's hard for me at this moment to know exactly, without getting into very specific topics, exactly what to be concerned about, what you should be concerned about. I will say this, what you don't want generally is you don't want very stale rates. I think Heather mentioned that the commission has said, okay, we're going to do 10-year contracts for a certain amount of solar. So that issue, let's just say, is settled for the moment. I meant the legislature. I don't know if I said commission, I meant legislature. But what you don't want is you don't want a rate that is set so far in advance and that the developer can lock in without really taking much risk, that they end up being out of the money or different from the current market by the time the solar actually comes on board. So for example, if someone can set a rate and hold on to it sort of for free without any liquidated damages or without any penalties in the event that they decide to cancel the project, that's a free option that you want to avoid giving those unnecessarily to the market, because the customer is essentially going to take the other side of that. And if the price doesn't work out for the developer, he'll cancel the project. But if the price does work out for the developer, well, then maybe the customer's paying too much.
And so I think George has done a good job about expressing our concerns when it comes to financial risk. I think one of the other things that's been top of mind for the company in terms of effects to customers and risk to customers is also reliability risk. So the other side of this equation in terms of attracting solar, one might also point to our queue. Our queue, our interconnection queue, is a source of frustration. But those interconnection policies serve to protect the assets that customers have paid for and are paying for, that keep the lights on and keep manufacturing plants running, et cetera. So we're also concerned with policy that removes or takes less of a strident look at our reliability obligations. And that's one of the reasons we were supportive of opening up the interconnection docket and looking at those procedures again, so that we can get to a manageable place and protect the assets and reliability that customers have already paid for and are continuing to pay for.
I appreciate both of you answering my question, and I just want to make it plain. What I heard is that there's some financial risk to the ratepayer because potentially they will pay too much for solar energy due to contract terms that are not fluid and flexible. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. That can happen, yes.
And then also, Attorney Smith brought up that reliability could be an issue. So let's just say hypothetically, the solar is pouring onto the market. Duke decides to back down generation. There's some weather event or something happens, solar's not available, maybe it takes some time for the other generation to come online. There may be some blackouts, some lights flickering, and now we got a bunch of upset people.
I think that's.
Because I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Commissioner. I heard a pause, and I didn't mean to interrupt you.
That's fine. Go ahead. That's what an aggressive litigator does. I gave you opportunity.
No, I was just going to tell you you're right. So hopefully that's a good reason to interrupt you. But that's certainly a concern. I would also say, that's one of the reasons why reserves are important. So whether we actually get there is another question, because we do have these reserve obligations, and it would be remiss for us, not to point to that fail-safe that we're obligated to keep up. And again, our resource planning experts are the real experts there. But what I was also referring to in terms of reliability is the commission will soon and parties will soon be looking at ways to improve the interconnection process and to address the interconnection queue. And one of our concerns is if there becomes a desire to minimize studies or to not look at the system and the impacts of interconnection in the most fulsome way, then we can have reliability concerns. So we do want to make sure that those interconnection procedures are correct and that they meet good engineering standards, and we don't want to back away from protecting the systems that customers have paid for in a rush to perhaps hook up stuff before it's ready.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, those are all the questions I have.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Williams. We'll go to other commissioners, and let me just remind all you aggressive litigators that Ms. Wheat can only say one thing at a time, so you're not going to make it if you overlap each other. Commissioner Irvin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brown, you mentioned that if there's excess generation from additional solar, there are two ways to deal with it. One is to sell it to other providers, and secondly, to cut generation in another area, like natural gas or coal. There's a third possibility, which is storage. And how far along are we with the technology for battery storage so that that gives us more flexibility for the system as a whole?
Yes, you're exactly right. There's storage. And in fact, one of the reasons that we expanded our pumped hydro is another form of storage. And we are actually using the pumped hydro or plan to use it to store surplus solar energy and use it in the periods when the solar is not producing. But batteries, specifically to your question about batteries, yes, there is promise there. There still is a lot of work to do, I think, to generally bring the cost of batteries down to a point at which it makes sense to use them for that, solely for that. There are other things batteries can do in the system planning world that they can manage small frequency derivations that we have to do today using conventional generation. But I don't think at this point economically they're there yet. But definitely something we're looking at, and something that, I think we're planning eventually. We plan to see batteries, the lithium type battery or similar type battery on our system for purposes like that.
So it's still, you're still monitoring the technological developments, and I'm sure have you kind of developed a plan as to how you might integrate that new technology once it's available?
We actually, yes, and we actually have got some limited deployment that we've done for some special targeted situations.
In the Carolinas?
In the Carolinas, and we have some that are planned in the Carolinas. Specifically, there are periods of time, I'm thinking primarily in North Carolina, in our western DEP territory, whereas near Asheville, there's a winter peak. And that peak lasts for a very short period of time. And so we actually are going to be deploying some small batteries to use the energy from the battery to meet that peak, at least in part. It will not meet the total peak. It will be able to meet, in part, the peak on certain circuits. Some of those circuits also have a capacity, they don't have a lot of capacity left. And what I mean by that is when a circuit has a certain amount of energy that can flow through it, the distribution circuit. And if people keep attaching to the distribution circuit, then we need to build the distribution circuit out to cover the new load. Well, in the meantime, batteries may be able to bridge that gap until we're able to actually build the capacity, or they may be able to eliminate the capacity. That's an example of what we're doing.
I would also note that we have a project in Anderson, a battery project in Anderson, and it's a really interesting project, and we have plans to come address that project in the coming weeks with the commission.
Great. One other thing that I wanted to ask about on your chart in terms of how the resource portfolio breaks out currently and in the future. You still are listing coal as being 8% of the total portfolio by 2033. And I know that we don't have any coal-fired plants in South Carolina.
Yes.
For Duke.
Right.
Santee Cooper has several, I believe. You have, what, 4 or 5 in North Carolina?
Yes, we actually have at least 5 that I can recall off the top of my head, and I'm not the expert, but yes.
Right. I'm just wondering if you've tried to give more thought to perhaps phasing coal out sooner, because that it seems that, you know, I know you want a diversified portfolio, but with the increasing solar and the decreasing cost of natural gas, and hopefully the relicensing of nuclear, if that happens at some point, wouldn't it be preferable to try to phase coal out because of the excess carbon footprint?
The company is continuously looking at this. I'm not directly involved in it, but I do know enough that the company is continuously looking at what can it do to further reduce its carbon dioxide emissions. These numbers here, I think, are based on the most recent IRPs. We'll be filing new IRPs that will be different than this coming up. I don't know exactly what they're going to look like. I'm not really in that group, but I'm generally aware that there are people at the company who are looking at the ability to accelerate our move away from coal. Yes.
I'm pleased to hear that, because it's the kind of the ugly outlier that affects us in so many ways in terms of trying to protect the environment and the health impact for asthmatics and those that have respiratory problems, and on and on and on. Then you've got the coal decommissioning and cleanup of coal ash that, we know is expensive. So I'm hoping that, that number will come way down sooner than later to try to address some of those issues. And the final thing I want to ask you about is I've heard that at least the auto industry is anticipating, and others, other futurists are predicting that by 2030, many of us will be driving electric vehicles. And so I'm wondering, do you all have a plan in place for South Carolina to have an expansion of the network for rechargeable stations? That's something that, the infrastructure has to be in place in advance of the sale, the use of electric vehicles and buses. I know that Proterra in Greenville, for example, has just sold Rock Hill a whole fleet of electric-powered buses. So it's coming. And what plans do you have for South Carolina to have the infrastructure in place for that?
I think I'll attempt just to answer a technical question. I'll note that the company does have a pending electric transportation docket before the commission right now, and a lot of the information the commissioners that you're asking about is in that docket. And so I will, since that wasn't part of the notice, I'll just save that, but just mention that that docket exists, and a lot of your answers to your questions are there once you get through the stack on your desk to see it. And then we also have some broader vision. I don't know if you want to speak to the broader vision.
Yeah, I think from a broader standpoint, included in our IRP plans is a forecasted vehicle adoption rate, and we do see electric vehicles continuing to increase substantially in percentage terms over the planning cycle. I'm not in the area that directly works on our infrastructure plans. I do know that we support electric vehicles, and we believe that the utilities can be part of the infrastructure investment necessary to bring them forward. But that's really all I know at this point in terms of detail.
I did hear that you've made a proposal in North Carolina, which kind of piqued my interest because we don't want to be left out in the equation. We'd like to be considered if when at the appropriate time. But I appreciate you responding to it, and we look forward to hearing more about it.
Mr. Nelson.
Commissioner Irvin's done, so I would like to say that, we do need to, and thank you, Heather, I appreciate you keeping us on track as best you could there, but that we just talk about this subject which has been noticed, which is Act 62.
Thank you. Any other questions, commissioners? Commissioner Howard.
I guess I got to give you a little background. I spent the weekend talking about decarbonization. And, so really you're trying to think I got to get a life. But does Duke have a zero emission, zero decarbonization goal? And if it is, what is that goal?
As of right now, we do not have a formal zero emissions goal as a company. However, I mentioned earlier in one of the earlier questions, there is a team working on just that question, is should the company put out a public zero emissions goal? And if so, what would it look like? And how would we get there? So that's the extent of what I know around it. But it is definitely top of mind. It is definitely something that the executive team and the company is focused on, providing more direction to everybody in terms of what we're trying to achieve in our generation mix. Yes.
Well, my next question is the two-part question. And the first part is, in the conversation was presented over the weekend, it was stated quite emphatically by most of the parties that it's going to be virtually impossible to reach any kind of zero goal of decarbonization without nuclear in the mix. Do you agree with that statement, number one? And number two, what role do you see as nuclear in the mix? And I will give you one more statement. When I say nuclear, I'm not talking about, well, I am in a certain extent, but also not traditional nuclear. There are innovations in the nuclear generation, besides small reactors, but there's all kind of apparently research going on nuclear generation to keep it in the mix. So would you comment on that? Well, and one other thing I'll add. In your generation mix, you show nuclear decreasing. You have a decrease in nuclear.
Yes.
Okay. So
and the reason why the nuclear is decreasing is because the capacity remains very much unchanged in this planning cycle. In other words, we're not building new nuclear in this horizon. We may be adding a little bit of capacity here or there from uprates, but the load keeps growing. So as a percentage of the total, it goes down. So to answer your question, I believe the company, and Heather, you can also chime in, but I believe the company 100% agrees that nuclear has to be part of the solution for a zero emissions framework. And I think the difficulty is that I don't know that we necessarily have consensus across the country that is the case.
Well, I thought I was in a unique position because I'm in a meeting with both international and obviously United States utilities. And I'm thinking that our utilities, you and Dominion, you represent a major marketing force, so to speak, in the U.S. energy market because of both of your sizes. So, y'all have quite an influence, I would think, on, setting energy policies for particularly the United States, not necessarily global. The other conflict I see, and I had some conversation with Mr. Scarborough about this, but are you familiar with the acronyms ESG?
ESG. No, I'm not familiar. It doesn't come to mind.
From what I understand, you should get familiar with it. ESG is an acronym for environmental, social, and governance. You do know.
Now the light bulb went off. Yes.
You want to comment on it? And the reason I say that is because, as I understand it, one of the ESG goals, the environmental part of it, is to have zero fossil fuel. In the same token, your fossil fuel, being natural gas, you're increasing it due to the 2033 period. Would you comment on ESG? Or?
Yes, the ESG, now that you mentioned it and told me what it stood for, I am familiar with it. There are many investors, and we have many investors, shareholder groups, who are very focused on what are the environmental goals of the companies in which they invest, particularly utilities. And so I know that our executive team is questioned frequently about that from these kinds of investors, and it seems to be an increasing portion of the investing world that has an ESG lens when they look at companies in terms of whether they want to take a substantial investment in that company or not. So from that standpoint, I'm familiar with that. And I do think it factors into, we have to balance the interests of our investors and the interests of our customers and obviously the policymakers that are in our states. But we are looking for solutions, and we're going to propose them as we can.
Well, the other two components of the ESG is social and governance. And the social, low income help, diversity and all that. And apparently, you're right, Wall Street is looking very, very strongly at this, and there's more and more emphasis being placed on a company having an ESG mandate or ESG goals. And so I thought you would probably have come across that. Another term that I've heard tossed around in the marketplace lately is green tariff. Is your social choice metering tariff your answer to a green tariff? Or is there a difference between a green tariff and your plan?
There is a difference, at least from our standpoint. A green tariff is not generally, and definitely for the programs we've filed, is not generally a case where the solar is actually on the premises of the customer. Usually the solar, at least in our case, in this Green Source Advantage case, the solar is at a large facility off-site, connected to the same grid, connected to the same utility, but it isn't going to be used on the premises to actually supply the premises with that energy. Instead, the premises and the customer can say, I'm responsible for the creation of that solar, and so therefore I can count that as additive in my sustainability goals that I have as a corporation, because my contract enabled that solar to happen. That's how it works. So the solar goes to the grid, It's used for all customers. The energy is used for all customers. And it's just that this particular customer has to pay the difference between the value of that energy and what the solar developer actually wants to build the solar off-site. The solar choice metering tariff is specifically for people who have solar on their premises. And they're going to put it on their roof or put it in their backyard, or put it wherever they can on their premises. And they're going to feed the power into the building, use the energy to the extent they can use the energy in the building, and then any surplus energy will be fed back to the grid. So they're a little different from that standpoint. And in that case, the customer either has to borrow money to make the investment, or they have the money to make the investment if they have it, or they lease the solar facility that they put on their premises. Those are the three financial options, generally speaking, that customers have for solar choice metering or net metering today.
The other comments, one of the other conversations we were in was a digitalized workforce. And my question is, a digitalized workforce, would it have any effect on calculation of avoided cost? Do you have any thoughts on that subject?
I do not. I mean, my initial thought would be ultimately a digitized workforce should be more efficient over time than a non-digitized workforce, which will reduce the costs of the company compared to if you don't have it. But how directly that would affect avoided cost isn't directly clear to me today.
I do think our experts would be able to address that when we get to that in the case. So
They're
just not us.
Mr. Nelson getting up and chastising me for violation of ex parte on the subject.
Maybe a little bit.
Okay. I know you wade into it, and so I guess I'll yield to you a little bit, but an IRP, as I understand it, and I'm not familiar with the latest, requirements in IRP, but when I first came on the commission, I think an IRP was a 15-year forecast. What do you see, but let's just cut it down to just generation mix. In 15 years, what do you see as Duke Energy generation mix in your position?
Well, I'm going to have to speak again in general terms because I don't.
That's the only way to speak to me is in general terms, because you get technical, I'm lost. So.
Yeah. I think what you're going to see is, hopefully what you will see, and what we're planning for is at least a doubling of the solar capacity, maybe even more than that over 15 years. It could be that we're able to take the solar up even more. I think that it would make sense for the company, and there are challenges, but it would make sense for the company to have wind in the mix. Wind is a renewable resource that actually produces
offshore or onshore?
Either. I think it's going to come down to cost and whether you can get the transmission built. I think you're going to see as little coal as possible. I don't know how little that will actually be. You'll see gas and you'll see nuclear. I mean, that would be, I think directionally that's what you will see. I don't know about the wind because there are challenges here in the Carolinas on the wind. Just because the really good onshore wind resources are in the Midwest, that's a long way. You can still do it, but it's a long way. And then the offshore wind is still, I think, relatively expensive.
I appreciate your answer. Just one last comment. You talked to Commissioner Williams about reserve obligations. I think that has a whole new definition for him than it does us sitting in this room with current position right now. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the exchange. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, any other questions? If not, we appreciate you being here today, and we are adjourned.
Thank you.